October 3, 1991. The night the sheriff's daughter vanished. The noise came first, a wave of sound so strange in Cedar Creek that it jolted you awake before you even knew why. Radios crackled, dogs barked and pulled against their leashes, voices rose and overlapped, some calling her name, others barking orders. You pressed your face to the window and saw the beams of flashlights slicing through the fog, scattering across lawns and fences, searching places that no one in town usually bothered to look at after dark. The stillness that usually hung over Cedar Creek at night had been shattered, replaced by a restless energy that made the air feel alive. At the center of it all stood the sheriff, his broad shoulders outlined beneath the only street lamp that worked on the corner of Main and Willow. His hat was pulled low, his jaw so tight it looked carved from stone. He pointed, ordered, directed, the kind of presence that would normally have calmed a crowd. But you, watching from your window, saw something in his eyes that unsettled you. Not panic. Not grief. Something sharper, colder, as if even now, with his own daughter missing, he was calculating. Neighbors who had spent years avoiding each other now trudged side by side through the tall grass at the edge of the field. Men swung lanterns, their beams swaying across the fog like restless fireflies. Women held blankets around their shoulders, whispering to each other in anxious, clipped tones. Teenagers, wide-eyed, clung to the edges of the search parties, whispering nervously but following anyway, eager not to be left out of the drama. For a few short hours, it felt like the town had truly come alive, everyone united under one terrible purpose: to find her. But you knew her differently than most. You remembered her in the classroom that very morning, 2 rows ahead of you, her hair pulled back, her pen scratching at the edges of her notebook as if the words in the textbook couldn't keep her attention. She had smiled faintly when your eyes met for a second, then dropped her gaze, as if even a glance was too much to hold. That small, fleeting moment was the last clear image you had of her, etched into your mind more deeply with every passing hour. The search stretched late into the night, flashlights combing the woods, cars crawling along dirt roads with headlights casting pale cones of light that made the fog glow silver. The sheriff's voice carried across the fields, sharp, commanding, a voice you were used to hearing at school assemblies and parades, a voice that made people obey. But behind the words you could hear something else, an edge, a strain, as if his control wasn't as complete as it looked. And then, as dawn bled across the horizon, the noise began to fade. Radios clicked silent. Dogs were leashed. People drifted homeward, tired and grim-faced, their breaths showing pale in the cool morning air. The sheriff stayed by the street lamp, but his posture had changed. His shoulders no longer scanned the horizon but hunched in thought. Within hours, the town was still again, the silence heavier than it had ever been before. By midday you noticed something strange: the search didn't resume. No flyers appeared on telephone poles. No news vans came rolling in from bigger towns. No detectives you didn't recognize arrived to ask questions. The chatter of neighbors was hushed, clipped, spoken only behind closed doors. The sheriff's daughter was gone, but it was as though the town had decided, almost overnight, to stop looking. At school her absence was like a wound. Her desk sat empty, the light catching the surface where her notebooks had always been piled. Teachers spoke carefully, their voices pitched in a way that made it clear they didn't want to linger on the subject. Some students whispered, about fights with her father, about her talking of leaving Cedar Creek, about a boy she might have met outside of town, but the whispers died the moment you approached. People knew more than they said, and their silence carried weight. You found yourself remembering little things, scraps that had seemed meaningless before but now burned bright in your mind, a piece of paper that had slipped from her folder weeks earlier, which she had snatched up with trembling hands before you could glimpse it. The way she had stared out the window during class, her pencil unmoving, her gaze distant and clouded. Once you had seen her cry quietly into her sleeve, and when you asked if she was all right, she shook her head fiercely and walked away. All of these moments returned now, weaving together into a picture you didn't want to see. By the end of the week the silence had settled fully over Cedar Creek. The search was forgotten, or at least buried beneath the routines of daily life. You walked past the sheriff's office and saw him sitting inside, his hat off, his head bowed over a stack of papers. He looked exhausted, but not the way you expected. Not like a father sick with worry, but like a man burdened with secrets too heavy to carry. It was Friday afternoon when the discovery came. After the final bell, the classroom emptied quickly, footsteps echoing down the hallway until you stood alone in the dimming light. You almost left, but something made you turn back toward her desk, the empty one, the one no one dared sit in. That was when you saw it. A notebook, tucked just far enough under a pile of abandoned worksheets that it might have been overlooked forever. Not one of the school's flimsy spiral pads, not anything issued by the district. This was personal, leather-bound, the edges frayed, the cover worn smooth by the brush of countless hands. Your pulse quickened as you reached for it. The leather felt warm against your fingertips, as though it had been waiting for you. You flipped the cover open, the hinges creaking faintly. Her name was written on the first page. And beneath it, a line that made your chest go cold. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. You carried the notebook home as if it were a stolen treasure, tucked beneath your jacket, pressed close against your ribs. The weight of it seemed far heavier than paper and leather could explain. Every step echoed in your chest like a drumbeat, a reminder that you weren't just holding an object, you were carrying a secret. The streets of Cedar Creek that evening were steeped in an unusual silence. Porch lights glowed dimly, casting golden halos into the fog, but behind the curtains there were no shadows of movement, no families gathered around televisions, no neighbors sitting on their porches. It was as though the entire town had retreated from view, watching you through invisible eyes. Each crack of gravel beneath your shoes felt too loud, each gust of wind too sharp, as though the world itself were trying to hush you. Twice you glanced over your shoulder, certain you would catch someone following. But the street was empty, stretching into darkness. That emptiness frightened you more than footsteps would have. It felt like the kind of silence that hides intention, the silence of people who know something you don't. By the time you reached your room, your hands were trembling. You shut the door and sat at your desk, the notebook lying in front of you like a living thing. Its cracked leather cover caught the lamplight, the worn edges telling you it had been carried everywhere, opened often, clutched tightly in moments of fear. You hesitated, your hand hovering above it, part of you screaming to put it away, to shove it into a drawer and forget. But another part whispered that this was why she had left it behind. Not to be hidden, but to be read. You opened it. The first pages lulled you with sketches and scribbled verses, the kind of idle distractions you'd seen her draw in the margins of textbooks. But slowly, gradually, the handwriting shifted. Lines pressed deeper into the paper. Words crowded close together, sentences jagged and urgent. The ink darkened, smudged in places where her hand must have trembled. It wasn't the writing of a girl daydreaming in class. It was the writing of someone who feared being silenced. She wrote about her father. Not with the warmth or pride you'd expect, but with dread. She described the way he left the house at night, his boots heavy on the stairs, the headlights of unmarked cars sweeping across her bedroom wall. She wrote of voices she didn't recognize, low and harsh, drifting through the walls. She wrote of money folded into envelopes, of her mother's tears, of threats disguised as conversations. And then, in a line scrawled across the margin like a slash, "He isn't who he says he is. The badge is only a mask. The real sheriff belongs to them." Your chest tightened. The words seemed to burn against the page, each letter carrying more weight than ink should. You thought of the search that had ended too quickly, the lack of flyers, the sudden silence. Maybe the town already knew. Maybe that was why no one spoke. You turned another page. Names leapt out at you: Daniels, Carter, Johnson. Familiar names. Shopkeepers. Farmers. The same people who had called her name into the night, who now smiled too quickly when you passed them. She described them meeting in the back of stores, exchanging envelopes, nodding with solemn agreement as though sealing a pact. The further you read, the heavier the notebook became in your hands. You felt her fear pressing from the pages, each word etched like a scar. Her neat handwriting dissolved into frantic scratches, the ink blotched, the letters uneven. One line repeated, underlined so hard it nearly tore the page: "If I disappear, it's because of him. Don't trust anyone." You closed the book, your breath sharp in your throat. The silence of your room seemed unbearable. Then, outside, a sound rose, the low hum of an engine. Your head snapped toward the window. Through the curtain you saw lights sweep across your wall, headlights, slow and deliberate. The car crawled past your house, its engine a steady growl. Then the lights cut out, plunging the street into darkness. For a long moment you could still hear it idling just beyond view, the faint metallic ticking of an engine cooling. You froze, every muscle locked, your breath held in your chest. The silence outside pressed in, thicker than fog. Then, just as slowly as it had arrived, the car rolled forward again, tires crunching softly against the gravel until it disappeared into the night. You sat there in the darkness, the notebook clutched tight, your pulse hammering in your ears. Every shadow in the room seemed deeper, every creak of the floorboards louder. You realized then that you were no longer a bystander. You were inside her story now, holding the words she hadn't dared to speak aloud. And as you stared at the cover of that notebook, its surface worn by her frightened hands, you understood something you couldn't take back: she hadn't simply vanished. She had been silenced. And now the silence was reaching for you. The notebook never left your side after that night. You carried it pressed beneath your jacket on your way to school, set it inside your backpack where no one could glimpse it, even slid it beneath your pillow as you slept. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a living burden, whispering at you in the dark, reminding you with every heartbeat that you now carried the truth, and the danger that came with it. The days blurred together, but the town seemed sharper now, as if the notebook had peeled away a layer of illusion. You noticed the way people averted their eyes when you mentioned her name. You noticed how quickly conversations ended when the sheriff's car drove past. Even the teachers seemed uneasy, their smiles brittle, their voices lower when they took attendance and passed over her name without comment. It was as if the entire community had agreed to erase her, to pretend she had never existed. At night, when the house was quiet and your parents asleep, you opened the notebook again. You traced the curve of her handwriting with your finger, studying the way the letters shifted over time. At first they were neat, careful, like any student's notes. But page by page, the script grew unsteady, frantic, the strokes pressing deeper into the paper until the back of each sheet bore the faint imprints of her fear. You could almost see her there, hunched over her desk in the dim glow of a lamp, glancing toward her door every few seconds, writing as fast as she could before someone came home. She described her father with a mixture of dread and resignation. He comes back late, smelling of smoke, his voice thick. They meet in the kitchen. Sometimes I hear names. Sometimes I hear numbers. Always whispers. She wrote that she had tried to ask her mother what was happening, but her mother only shook her head and told her to keep quiet, to stay out of things she didn't understand. One page caught your breath. The ink was smeared, the lines jagged. He doesn't want me here. He wants me gone. He says I talk too much. He says people notice what I notice. If I tell anyone, I'll disappear like the others. The others? You froze, rereading the words again and again. She hadn't been the first? You tried to think back, to remember if there had been other names, other sudden absences in Cedar Creek. There had been, you realized, kids who supposedly moved away in the middle of the year, families who left town without saying goodbye. You remembered one boy from 2 grades below you, who vanished one summer and whose family's house was sold within a month. You remembered a girl who had transferred schools suddenly, though no one ever knew why. It had never seemed unusual then. But now, with the notebook in your hands, it twisted into a pattern. And it was all tied to him. The sheriff. That night you dreamed of the search again. The beams of flashlights cutting the fog. The sheriff's figure under the street lamp, his eyes gleaming not with fear but with something colder. When you woke, your sheets were damp with sweat and the notebook lay open across your chest, as though it had been reading you in return. The next morning, you left for school early, clutching the book in your backpack. The air smelled of rain, the streets slick with dew. As you passed the sheriff's office, you saw him through the window, leaning back in his chair, speaking with someone you didn't recognize. The man's face was obscured, his back to the glass, but the sheriff's expression was sharp, his smile thin, nothing like the grief-stricken father people whispered about. You slowed, but before you could linger, the sheriff's eyes flicked toward the window. For one breathless second, you were certain he saw you. You hurried on, heart hammering, but for the rest of the day you felt his gaze clinging to your back. That afternoon, while the halls were empty, you slipped into her old locker. You had walked past it a dozen times that week, the metal door closed, the lock hanging loose. You didn't know why you tried it, maybe you hoped, maybe you feared, but when you tugged, it opened with a screech of rust. Inside was a stack of papers, old assignments curling at the edges, and at the very back, folded into quarters, another note in her handwriting. Your throat tightened as you unfolded it. He meets them at the river. I've seen the cars. If I can prove it, I'll finally be free. Your hands shook as you slid the paper into your pocket. You glanced around the empty hallway, half expecting someone to be watching. When you turned, you could have sworn you saw a shadow flicker at the end of the hall. You couldn't shake the feeling that someone had seen you at her locker. The note crumpled in your pocket felt like a glowing ember, burning hotter the longer you carried it. When the final bell rang, you slipped out of school without speaking to anyone, your eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The walk home had never felt so long. At home you locked your bedroom door and spread the notebook and the folded note side by side on your desk. The handwriting matched, sharp, hurried strokes, ink that sometimes smudged under the weight of her hand. She had written about the river. About cars. About proof. You pictured her sneaking out at night, slipping down the gravel paths, hiding in the tall grass by the water to watch headlights flicker in the dark. The thought of her alone out there made your stomach turn. You opened the notebook again, flipping deeper this time. The entries grew more desperate, her words crowding the margins. I hear him on the phone. He says my name like it's a threat. He says I'll ruin everything. He says I'm not his problem to fix. Another page. I saw them in the kitchen last night. They didn't know I was listening. They said something about a payment, about keeping quiet. He told them he would handle me. I don't know what that means. The handwriting broke off there, the ink smeared as if she had been interrupted. You closed the book and pressed your palms against your eyes, trying to block out the image it painted. But it was no use. The truth was crawling into every corner of your mind now, reshaping the town you thought you knew. Every street you walked, every smile you saw from a neighbor, every nod from a teacher, all of it seemed different. Hollow. That evening you tried to distract yourself with homework, but your eyes kept drifting to the window. The street outside was darker than usual. Only one porch light burned at the far end, and it flickered as if it too were nervous. You told yourself you were being paranoid, but then you saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. Still. Watching. You froze. Your breath caught in your throat. The figure didn't move for several seconds. Then, slowly, it turned and walked away, swallowed by the fog. You rushed to the window, pressing your face to the glass, but by then the street was empty again. Your parents didn't notice your restlessness over dinner. They asked about school, about assignments, about whether you'd thought of applying to colleges out of town. You answered with half-truths, nodding when you needed to, chewing slowly, forcing yourself to swallow. You wanted to tell them. You wanted to slide the notebook across the table and beg them to read it. But you couldn't. Because even as you imagined the words on your tongue, you heard her warning echo in your head, don't trust anyone. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, you lay in bed with the notebook open on your chest. You tried to read more, but your eyes kept blurring, the words smearing into shapes. You set it aside and closed your eyes, but the silence outside pressed against your walls. It was then you heard it, the slow crunch of tires on gravel. You sat up, heart hammering. Through the thin curtain you saw the glow of headlights, moving deliberately, slowly, as if whoever drove wasn't in a hurry to pass. The lights slid across your ceiling, then vanished. The car stopped. You held your breath. The engine idled softly, steady as a heartbeat. You could almost imagine it vibrating through the floorboards. You counted the seconds in your head, 10, 20, 30, each one stretching until it felt unbearable. Finally the engine revved, low and controlled, and the car rolled forward, disappearing into the night. You sat in the dark long after it was gone, clutching the notebook to your chest. You couldn't shake the certainty that the silence outside wasn't empty. Someone was out there, waiting, just as she had feared. When you finally fell asleep, the dreams came back. The sheriff's eyes under the street lamp. Her desk, empty except for the notebook. The words written over and over, carved deep into the paper like a plea: if I disappear, it's because of him. Don't trust anyone. You woke with the dawn, your sheets tangled, your breath ragged. And as the light spilled across your room, you realized you were already entangled in something much larger than yourself. Because the sheriff's daughter hadn't just vanished. She had left you the evidence, and now someone wanted to make sure you stayed quiet too. The silence in Cedar Creek had always been there if you listened closely enough, woven into the slow rhythm of life, into the creak of porch swings and the distant hum of cicadas. But after she disappeared, the silence changed. It wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, thick, heavy, intentional, as though the whole town had agreed to keep its voice low, to never speak too loudly, to bury what they all knew under layers of quiet. You noticed it everywhere. In the school hallways, where teachers avoided your eyes and skipped over her name during roll call as if it might burn their tongues. In the diner downtown, where conversation stopped when the sheriff walked in, only to resume in hurried whispers the moment he left. In the way your neighbors shut their doors earlier than usual, porch lights clicking off before the sun had fully set, curtains drawn tight against the night. It was as if Cedar Creek itself had decided to smother her memory. But you couldn't forget. The notebook wouldn't let you. Every evening you sat at your desk, turning its pages slowly, reading the words she had left behind. At first you had treated it like evidence, scanning for clues, piecing together fragments. But as the days passed, it became something else, almost like a conversation, a fragile connection to someone who was no longer there. Her handwriting filled the pages in looping lines, shifting as her fear grew. The early entries were careful, evenly spaced. Later ones slanted, rushed, letters colliding, words nearly tearing through the thin paper. It was as if you could see her unraveling in real time, the ink carrying her fears straight into your hands. One night you lingered over a single page, your lamp casting a weak glow over the words, "They think I don't see. But I do. I write it all down because one day someone has to know. I'm not safe here. Not with him. Not with any of them." You read it again and again, the lines digging into you like splinters. She hadn't trusted her own father, the man the whole town turned to for safety. She hadn't trusted anyone. And now, holding her words, you understood why. It was during lunch a week later that you found yourself drawn to her locker again. You had walked past it dozens of times since she vanished, each time feeling your stomach tighten, each time hearing a whisper in the back of your mind, "Look." That day, the hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above, the echo of voices fading as students filed out to the cafeteria. You stopped in front of the dull gray metal door. The lock dangled uselessly, as if it had been forgotten. Your hand shook as you pulled it open, the hinges groaning, the sound so loud in the empty corridor it made you flinch. Inside was a time capsule. Faded assignments with red pens scrawled across the top. A dog-eared paperback novel with her name written in careful cursive on the inside cover. A crumpled flyer from last year's homecoming game. The air smelled faintly of dust and something sweeter, maybe her perfume lingering in the paper fibers. At the very back, taped against the metal with peeling yellow tape, was a folded piece of paper. You peeled it away, heart racing, and unfolded it with trembling hands. Her handwriting. You would have recognized it anywhere. "He doesn't know I've been following. The cars meet by the river at night. Always the same people. Always the same money. If I can get proof, I can finally escape him." The words struck like lightning. She hadn't just been afraid. She had been investigating. She had been gathering evidence. She had a plan. You shoved the note into your pocket, shut the locker with a hollow clang, and turned, and your stomach dropped. At the far end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadow cast by the exit sign, a figure stood. Still. Watching. You blinked, your pulse thundering in your ears, but by the time your eyes adjusted, the space was empty. You hurried out, your footsteps echoing too loudly, the note burning against your thigh where it rested in your pocket. That night you laid it beside the notebook, studying them together. The notebook was her diary, her fears, her warnings. The note was something else, sharper, more deliberate, a record of her plan. Proof. She had seen the cars. She had written the names. She had tried to leave a trail. And then she had vanished. You opened the notebook again, flipping deeper. The words grew frantic. He watches me. He says I shouldn't talk. He says if I tell, I'll regret it. I think he knows I've been listening. I think he knows I've seen the river. On another page, scribbled across the margin in nearly illegible scrawl, I have pictures. I don't know if they're enough, but they have to be. I'll hide them where only I can find them. If I disappear, someone has to look. Pictures. The word burned itself into your thoughts. She had taken photographs. Proof of whatever her father was hiding. And if she had hidden them, they might still be out there. But even as the spark of hope flared, the fear deepened. Because if you were finding her trail, someone else could too. And if they realized what you were reading, you wouldn't just be a bystander anymore. You would be a target. That night you dreamed of the river. You saw her crouched in the tall grass, clutching a camera, her face pale in the moonlight. You saw the sheriff standing on the far bank, his eyes glowing cold in the dark. And then you saw yourself, frozen, unable to move, as his gaze turned directly on you. You woke drenched in sweat, the notebook still open across your chest, as though it too had been watching. The following morning you couldn't shake the heaviness in your chest. The words from the note and the notebook spun through your head on a loop, cars at the river, proof, pictures, if I disappear. They clung to you as you dressed, as you forced down a half-hearted breakfast, as you walked the same streets you had known your entire life. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. Every house seemed darker, every porch light weaker, every neighbor's glance sharper. At school you caught yourself scanning faces, searching for signs of guilt. Daniels, who ran the hardware store, was standing near the cafeteria talking to the gym teacher, his hand gripping the man's shoulder just a little too tightly. Carter, who usually joked with students, barely raised his head when you walked past. Johnson, who owned half the farmland outside of town, sat with the principal in a hushed conversation that stopped the moment you entered the office to drop off a late assignment. They were just names in her notebook, scribbled in the margins, but now they seemed to follow you everywhere. You told yourself you were imagining things, that you were seeing patterns because you wanted to. But deep down, you knew better. She had seen something real, and now, through her words, you were seeing it too. That afternoon you lingered after class, waiting until the hallways were empty. You walked slowly, listening to the echo of your footsteps against the lockers, each sound magnified in the stillness. Her locker loomed at the end of the corridor, its door shut tight again. You didn't dare open it this time. Instead, you leaned against the wall, staring at the dull gray metal, trying to picture her standing there. You almost expected the door to swing open, for her to step out laughing, telling you it had all been a mistake. But the silence held. As you turned to leave, you caught a flicker of movement in the corner of your vision. Down the hall, past the trophy case, a figure slipped out the side door. You hurried forward, but by the time you reached it, the door creaked shut against the wind. You pushed it open and stepped into the sunlight, scanning the empty schoolyard. Nothing. Just the faint sound of leaves rustling and the steady hum of cicadas. Whoever it was, they were gone. That night you read further into the notebook. Her handwriting was frantic now, words pressed so deep into the paper that the next page bore the ghostly outline of her fear. I can't tell anyone. They're all with him. Even the ones who smile at me. Even the ones who wave. They're all his. If I say anything, it will be the last thing I say. Another page. He asked me where I'd been last night. I think he knows. I told him I was at the library, but he didn't believe me. He said I should be careful, that accidents happen. He looked at me like he already knew what he was going to do. Your hands shook as you closed the notebook. For a long time you just sat there, staring at the cover, listening to the faint creaks of the house around you. The sound of the refrigerator humming. The wind rattling a loose shutter. Ordinary noises, but they all felt sinister now. You couldn't shake the feeling that someone was listening. When you finally crawled into bed, exhaustion pulling at your body, you left the notebook on the nightstand, its weight pressing into the room like a second presence. Sleep came fitfully, dragging you into dreams you didn't want to see. You dreamed of the river again. Headlights cutting across the mist. Men in heavy coats passing envelopes from hand to hand. Her face, pale and determined, crouched in the tall grass with a camera clutched to her chest. Then the sheriff turned, his eyes locking onto you across the water, his voice booming like thunder. You shouldn't be here. You woke with a start, your heart slamming against your ribs. The room was dark, but not silent. From outside came the sound of tires rolling slowly over gravel. You held your breath, listening. The car crept past your house, headlights dimmed, engine low. You pulled the curtain aside just a fraction and saw it, a dark sedan, windows tinted, moving slower than any normal car should. For one moment, as it passed under the street lamp, you thought you saw someone in the passenger seat turn their head toward your window. The car didn't stop. It continued down the street, swallowed by the fog. But the silence it left behind pressed even harder. You sat awake the rest of the night, the notebook clutched in your lap, your eyes fixed on the shadows creeping across the walls. The fear wasn't in your imagination anymore. It was out there, circling, waiting. By dawn you knew two things with chilling certainty. The sheriff's daughter had been closer to revealing the truth than anyone realized. And now, because you were following her trail, you were next. The morning after the car crept past your house, Cedar Creek looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The streets were too clean, the windows too still, the faces too blank when you passed them on your way to school. You tried to tell yourself that nothing had changed, that you were only seeing shadows because you had been reading too much in the notebook, but the truth was harder to ignore with every step you took. The silence was heavier now, almost deliberate, as if every porch, every shop, every familiar street corner was holding its breath. At school you caught whispers that weren't meant for you, conversations that broke off mid-sentence the moment you entered a room. Even your teachers seemed uneasy, their voices slipping when they reached her name on the roll call before skipping quickly ahead. Nobody said it, but you could feel it. They knew more than they admitted, and they were terrified of saying the wrong thing. It was just after last period that you saw him, the sheriff. He was leaning against his cruiser in the parking lot, his hat tilted low against the sunlight, his arms crossed. Beside him stood Mr. Carter, the gym teacher, the same name you had seen scribbled in her notebook, underlined twice. They were speaking in low voices, their heads bent close, and though you couldn't hear what they were saying, the sight alone made your stomach clench. When Carter noticed you, he stiffened. For a moment his lips parted as if to say something, but then he closed them, nodded quickly to the sheriff, and walked away, leaving the two of you alone across the stretch of pavement. The sheriff's eyes found yours. He didn't look away. Instead, he pushed off the cruiser and walked toward you, his boots crunching over gravel in slow, measured steps. You wanted to run, to slip back into the safety of the building, but your feet locked in place. "You've been keeping late nights," he said, his voice even, carrying just enough warmth to sound casual but not enough to hide the edge underneath. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. It was a performance, and you were his only audience. "In a town like this, you hear things. And people are saying you're out wandering when you should be home." Your throat went dry. You forced your voice into something steady, though it wavered at the edges. "Homework," you muttered, shrugging as if it meant nothing. "Projects." You know how it is. The sheriff tilted his head, studying you. For a moment you thought he might press, might push until your excuses crumbled, but instead he let the silence stretch, the weight of his gaze enough to make you want to sink into the ground. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice dropping lower, quieter, meant only for you. Homework's good. Keeps the mind busy. Just make sure you don't go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Some stories, he said, the corners of his mouth twitching into something colder than a smile, are too heavy for kids to carry. The words hit harder than any shout. You nodded quickly, not trusting yourself to answer, and he clapped a heavy hand onto your shoulder. The weight of it lingered long after he let go, like a brand pressed into your skin. Then he turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away without another glance. You stood frozen in the parking lot long after the engine's growl faded. He knew. Maybe not everything, not yet, but enough. And the warning in his voice wasn't subtle. It was a line drawn, a test to see if you would cross it. That night you sat with the notebook open on your bed, turning the pages back and forth, searching for something you had missed. Near the back, written in jagged handwriting that slanted across the page, you found it, the old barn. The one near the orchard. If anything happens, it will still be there. The key is in the desk drawer. You stared at the words until they blurred. A place. A clue. She had hidden something, just as she had promised. The orchard was only half a mile outside town, the barn abandoned for years. You remembered it from childhood, a place where kids dared each other to spend the night, where the air smelled of dust and mold, and the rafters sagged with age. You hadn't thought of it in years, but now the image was sharp in your mind. The thought of going there alone made your chest tighten, but the notebook left you no choice. You waited until your parents were asleep, then slipped quietly out the back door, the notebook tucked under your jacket, your footsteps muffled on the damp grass. The night air was cold enough to sting your lungs, and the clouds overhead swallowed the moon, leaving the streets dim and uncertain. You kept to the edges, avoiding the glow of streetlights, listening for the growl of an engine that never came but always seemed moments away. By the time you reached the orchard, your pulse was racing. The trees stood in neat, endless rows, their branches skeletal in the dim light, the smell of fallen apples sour in the cool air. The barn rose at the far end, its roof sagging, its boards gray with rot. It looked smaller than you remembered, but more threatening too, as though it had been waiting all these years for this moment. You gripped the rusted handle and pulled the door open. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing too loudly into the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust, motes drifting in the thin beams of moonlight that pierced through cracks in the roof. The wooden floor creaked beneath your weight, each step a warning. The smell of mildew and hay long rotted clung to your throat. The desk was still there, shoved against the far wall, its surface scarred by initials carved years ago by kids who no longer lived here, maybe no longer lived at all. Your hand shook as you pulled the drawer open. Inside was a jumble of rusted nails, scraps of paper, and beneath them, a small tin box. The lock had broken long ago. You pried it open, your breath caught in your chest. Inside were photographs. Your hands trembled as you lifted them out, one by one. The images were grainy, dark, but clear enough to tell their story, men standing by the riverbank under the cover of night, the glow of headlights illuminating their faces. Envelopes being passed from hand to hand. In one photo, blurrier than the rest, the sheriff himself stood among them, his hand gripping another man's shoulder, a thin smile stretched across his face. Proof. You shoved the photographs back into the tin and clutched it against your chest, your heart pounding so hard it hurt. And then you heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside the barn. The footsteps outside the barn froze you in place. For a heartbeat you thought maybe it was the wind, maybe an animal scurrying through the orchard. But then you heard it again, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dirt with the weight of someone who knew you were inside. You shoved the photographs back into the tin, your fingers trembling, and pushed the drawer shut as quietly as you could. The sound seemed deafening anyway, echoing in the hollow barn. You held your breath, ears straining. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then the door creaked. A sliver of moonlight split the darkness as the barn door eased open. You slipped behind the desk, crouching low, your breath ragged, your hand pressed against your chest to quiet the hammer of your heart. Dust tickled your nose, but you didn't dare move. Through the crack you saw the outline of a figure pause in the doorway, head tilted, listening. For what felt like an eternity the figure stood there, the silence stretching thin and sharp. Then the door groaned wider, and boots crossed the threshold. Each step was measured, unhurried, as though whoever it was had no doubt you were here. You clenched your fists around the tin box, the metal edges digging into your palms. Every instinct screamed at you to run, but you forced yourself to stay still, to wait. The footsteps drew closer, boards creaking beneath the weight. Then, suddenly, they stopped, right beside the desk. You dared a glance upward and caught a glimpse of the man's boots. Heavy, worn, caked in mud. The kind of boots you'd seen 100 times on the sheriff. Your chest seized. You squeezed your eyes shut, praying he wouldn't look down, praying he wouldn't hear the ragged pull of your breath. Seconds stretched into forever. Then, just as slowly as he had entered, the man turned. His boots carried him across the barn, back toward the door. The hinges groaned, the door shut, and the silence fell again. You didn't move for several minutes, your body trembling so hard you thought the floor would give you away even now. Finally, when you could breathe again, you crawled from behind the desk, clutching the tin box. The barn felt suffocating, its shadows pressing in, urging you to leave. You slipped outside into the orchard, the cool night air hitting your face like water. But the relief didn't last. The orchard stretched endlessly in the dark, the rows of trees forming narrow corridors that seemed to close around you. You started down one row, your steps quick, your ears straining for any sound. And then you heard it again, footsteps. Behind you this time, closer, faster. You broke into a run, branches whipping at your face, the tin box banging against your chest with each stride. The trees blurred around you, your breath tearing at your throat. You didn't look back, you couldn't, but you knew they were there, closing the distance. The edge of the orchard appeared ahead, the faint glow of a street lamp bleeding through the fog. You sprinted toward it, heart slamming, legs burning, until you burst out onto the dirt road. The silence of the night swallowed you, but the footsteps had stopped. You spun around, gasping, but the orchard stood still, nothing moving among the skeletal branches. It was worse than if you had seen someone. Because now you knew they wanted you to know they were there. You clutched the box tighter and ran the rest of the way home, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. By the time you slipped through your back door, your shirt was damp with sweat, your lungs aching. You locked the door, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto your bed with the tin box still in your arms. When you finally found the courage to open it again, the photographs stared back at you. Men by the river, money changing hands, the sheriff's face caught in the glow of headlights. Proof that the town's protector was its greatest danger. But proof was dangerous too. You tucked the box beneath the floorboards of your room, covering it carefully with the rug. Even hidden, you felt the weight of it pressing down, a silent reminder that you were no longer just holding her secrets, you were holding her fight. And as you lay awake, listening to the hum of the night, you knew the footsteps in the orchard hadn't been a mistake. They had let you live this time. Because now they wanted you to be afraid. The photographs didn't feel like paper anymore. Even hidden beneath the floorboards, you could sense them, a pulse beneath the house, a secret that hummed louder than the refrigerator in the kitchen, or the wind rattling the shutters. You lay awake at night imagining their weight pressing through the wood, as though the images themselves had a presence, whispering that you couldn't pretend you didn't see them. Every time you closed your eyes, you saw the sheriff's face caught in the grain of a photograph, the harsh light of headlights washing his features pale, his thin smile sharp enough to cut. He hadn't been looking at the camera, but the expression felt like it was meant for you. Proof. Enough to ruin him. Enough to prove that she hadn't been imagining things. Enough to show that Cedar Creek was rotten beneath its quiet surface. But proof, you realized, wasn't protection. Proof was danger. Because if you had it, they would come for you. The next day, the town itself felt different, though nothing had changed on the surface. The bakery still put out trays of cinnamon rolls, the diner still buzzed with coffee and clinking cups, children still hurried across crosswalks when the bell rang at the school. But people looked at you differently. Their gazes lingered half a second longer, their voices dropped the moment you approached. Even your friends had changed. They no longer met your eyes in the hallway, no longer lingered to share jokes at lunch. You caught one of them staring at you during class, only for him to look away quickly when you noticed. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even suspicion. It was fear, a fear of being near you, of being caught in whatever shadow now followed you through town. By afternoon you couldn't stand the noise of whispered voices anymore. You slipped into the library, a sanctuary of still air and dust, the faint smell of old paper settling your nerves for the briefest moment. You chose a table in the back, far from the windows, and opened the notebook. You had read most of it already, but something told you to look again, to comb through the pages slowly. Near the center you found it, an entry you must have skimmed before, written in slanted, hurried lines that nearly tore through the paper. I can't keep running. I can't keep hiding. If I don't do something, no one will. They think I'm weak, but I'm not. I'll show them. I'll show everyone. The words made your chest tighten. She hadn't been imagining monsters and shadows. She had been preparing to fight. She had been building towards something, and she hadn't been wrong. You shut the notebook and stared at the ceiling of the library, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Around you, students whispered about homework, teachers shelved books, the librarian tapped quietly at her desk. None of them knew what you knew. None of them carried what you carried. When you finally stepped outside, dusk had fallen. The air was cool and damp, tinged with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. You walked quickly, your ears tuned to every crunch of gravel, every rustle of leaves. The town was too quiet, the streets too empty. And then you saw it, the sheriff's cruiser parked at the corner. He leaned against the hood as though he had been waiting for you, his arms crossed, his hat tilted low. When he saw you, he pushed off the hood with a deliberate ease and started toward you. Evening, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. Walking home late again? You ought to be careful. Lot of accidents happen after dark. You stopped in your tracks. The air seemed to thicken between you. I'm just coming from the library, you stammered, hating how weak your voice sounded. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on you. Library. My daughter used to go there too. Always scribbling things down, always filling notebooks. She had an imagination, that girl. Dangerous thing, imagination. Makes you see things that aren't there. The words sent a chill through you. He wasn't guessing. He knew. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Up close, you could smell the faint trace of smoke clinging to his jacket, the leathery scent of his gloves. His smile never reached his eyes. You know, I've been in this town a long time, he continued, his voice softer now, pitched low as if meant only for you. And I've learned something. People who carry secrets too big for them? They don't last. The weight drags them under. Best to let things go before they bury you. Your throat tightened, but you forced yourself to speak. What happened to her? For the first time, his smile slipped. Just for a second. His eyes hardened. Then he leaned in, his voice a whisper hot against your ear. Burn the book. Forget the pictures. Or you'll end up like her. He patted your shoulder once, heavy, deliberate, and then turned, walking back to his cruiser. The engine rumbled to life, the red taillights glowing like embers as he pulled away into the night. You stood frozen on the sidewalk long after he was gone, the echo of his words crawling across your skin. At home you rushed to your room, bolted the door, and pried the tin box from beneath the floorboards. You spread the photographs across your desk, the grainy images lit by the weak glow of your lamp. Men by the river. Envelopes changing hands. The sheriff's thin smile captured forever. Proof. Undeniable, unavoidable. Enough to destroy him. But her warning echoed louder than the photographs themselves. Don't trust anyone. The police? He was the police. The townsfolk? They were in the pictures. Your parents? You wanted to believe you could, but if he had gotten to them too. You sat back, your head in your hands, the photographs fanned out like playing cards before you. The weight of them pressed down, heavier than stone. You weren't just holding her secrets anymore. You were holding her last chance to be heard. And you knew with a bone-deep certainty, the sheriff wasn't going to wait much longer. Sleep didn't come that night. You lay awake staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house amplified into threat, every rustle of leaves outside your window a warning. The photographs sat hidden beneath the floorboards again, but you swore you could feel them, as if they radiated heat through the wood, as if the faces caught in their grainy frames were watching you as much as you watched them. By dawn, your body ached with exhaustion. You slipped out of bed and pressed your palms against the window. The street below was still, but too still, like a stage set waiting for the curtain to rise. Across the road, Mrs. Daniels was sweeping her porch, though she didn't look at you. When her husband stepped out a moment later, he glanced up toward your window, his gaze lingering a moment too long before he turned away. You pulled the curtain shut, heart pounding. They knew. Or at least they suspected. And if they suspected, it meant the sheriff had already spread the word. That day at school was unbearable. Every whisper felt pointed, every laugh edged with cruelty, every silence sharpened like a knife. At lunch you sat alone, your friends huddled at another table, their voices low, their eyes occasionally darting toward you. You wanted to scream, to slam the notebook down and force them to read what she had written, but the warning echoed too loudly in your mind: don't trust anyone. By the time the final bell rang, your nerves were raw. You left quickly, keeping your head down, your backpack heavy on your shoulders. But as you stepped into the cool evening air, you stopped short. The sheriff was waiting. His cruiser was parked across the street, the engine idling, exhaust curling into the air. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, hat low over his eyes. When he saw you, he smiled. That same thin, practiced smile. You froze, the crowd of students flowing past you like a river, none of them daring to notice what was happening. "Ride home?" he called, his voice smooth, easy, as though he were offering a kindness. You shook your head quickly, your throat too tight for words. His smile didn't fade. "Suit yourself? But remember what I told you. Secrets eat people alive." He slid into the driver's seat, the cruiser rolling slowly down the street, its taillights glowing red through the fog. You walked home on shaking legs, every step heavier than the last. That night you sat at your desk with the notebook open before you and the photographs spread across the wood. The lamplight caught the images, sharp and unforgiving: men at the river, envelopes exchanged, the sheriff's face unmasked. Proof. You could take it to the state police, to the newspapers, to anyone outside of Cedar Creek. It would destroy him. But would you live long enough to see it? Her final words echoed louder than ever: "If I disappear, it's because of him. Don't trust anyone." You stared at the notebook, at her handwriting pressed so deep it nearly tore the paper. You felt the fear in her words, but also the determination. She had tried to fight. She had left this behind not to bury it, but to pass it on. To you. And you understood then, surviving wasn't enough. The sheriff wanted silence. The town wanted silence. But her words, her photographs, her fight, they demanded a voice. You gathered the photographs, slid them back into the tin, and wrapped the notebook tight. Your hands shook as you packed them into your backpack. Then you sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the night, waiting for morning. The bus to the next town left at dawn. You would take it. You would go to the state police, maybe even farther. You didn't know if they would listen, if they would believe a kid from a quiet town with nothing but a notebook and a handful of photographs. But you would try. Because silence was what killed her. And you refused to let it kill you too. When the first light of dawn touched Cedar Creek, you stepped out into the cold air, your backpack heavy, your pulse racing. The streets were empty, but you felt them watching. Curtains stirred. Doors cracked open. The whole town knew. The whole town was waiting. You walked anyway. Every step carried the weight of her words, the memory of her handwriting, the image of her face in your dreams. Every step was a defiance, a refusal to be another name swallowed by Cedar Creek's silence. At the bus stop, you looked back one last time. The town lay quiet, shrouded in fog, the sheriff's office a dark silhouette at the end of Main Street. You tightened your grip on the backpack. If the sheriff wanted silence, he was going to have to chase you for it. And for the first time since you opened the notebook, you felt stronger than afraid.